Sit down and be quiet. You have no idea who you are sitting among. My husband Julian whispered with a patronizing smile. The glittering Seattle ballroom faded into humiliating silence. He thought I was his clueless accessory, meant to be hidden, but Julian did not realize the most powerful man at our table had just dropped his fork, staring at me in absolute shock. Within seconds, that exact man would completely destroy Julian's perfect 10-year career. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Delilah Wright. I am 38 years old, and on this particular Friday evening, I found myself slowly suffocating under the brilliant crystal chandeliers of the grandest ballroom in Seattle. We were seated at the table of honor for the West Coast Technology Summit. The air inside the cavernous hall was thick with the heavy scent of expensive cologne, roasted pheasant, and raw, unrestrained ambition. The soft clinking of fine silver against porcelain and the steady hum of networking executives created a continuous wall of sound that made my head throb. To my left sat my husband, Julian. Julian was a business development director whose entire existence revolved around climbing the corporate ladder and securing his place among the wealthy elite. Tonight, he wore a bespoke charcoal suit that cost more than 2 months of an average person's rent. To Julian, I was not an equal partner in our marriage. I was merely a decorative prop. I was the quiet, agreeable wife he brought along to project the flawless image of a stable, grounded family man to the high society circles he so desperately wanted to impress. Whenever someone approached our table, he introduced me with a dismissive wave of his hand, steering the conversation away before anyone could bother asking me any questions of real substance. The hollow laughter of venture capitalists echoed around me, amplifying the deep exhaustion settled in my bones. I felt entirely out of place, isolated in this sea of polished sociability and fake smiles. My mind was still miles away, locked inside the sterile, fluorescent rooms of Aegis Core Solutions. Aegis Core was a deliberately quiet company, rarely mentioned in the flashy tech magazines that Julian religiously read. Yet we held the digital keys to some of the most critical data security networks in the entire country. I had just survived a grueling 80-hour workweek. For 6 days straight, I had been buried under complex algorithmic structures, desperately patching a critical vulnerability that threatened a national healthcare database. My eyes burned from staring at endless lines of code, and my shoulders ached from the immense weight of the silent responsibility I carried. Yet, here I was, forced into a tight, uncomfortable velvet evening gown, smiling politely while Julian paraded me around like a mandatory accessory. The contrast between the glittering surface of my marriage and its deeply hollow reality had never been more painfully apparent. Julian spent the first 2 hours of the banquet aggressively working the room, shaking hands, and laughing loudly at jokes that held no humor. He would occasionally place a heavy, possessive hand on my shoulder, giving the onlookers the grand illusion of affection. But the moment their eyes turned away, his grip would loosen instantly, and his smile would vanish, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze as he scanned the room for his next target. I was nothing more than a silent shadow in his blinding quest for a corner office. As the formal dinner progressed to the main course, the lively chatter around our table shifted away from golf courses and stock portfolios to a much more serious topic: the recent surge in global cybersecurity breaches. A senior executive from a prominent cloud storage firm leaned forward, loudly lamenting the rising sophistication of modern ransomware attacks. He confidently proclaimed to the table that current encryption models were fundamentally flawed and that hackers were simply bypassing perimeter defenses with brute force algorithms. I listened carefully to his words. His assessment was entirely incorrect. The issue was not brute force at all. It was a structural blind spot within the legacy synchronization protocols their companies blindly relied upon. It was the exact architectural vulnerability I had spent the last week dissecting and neutralizing at my office, driven by a rare spark of professional engagement and a desire to contribute meaningfully to the discussion. I leaned forward slightly. I took a deep breath, preparing to politely correct his misconception and explain a basic structural concept that would clarify the issue for everyone present. Before a single word could leave my lips, I felt a sharp, bruising pressure on my left thigh under the thick linen tablecloth. Julian had driven his fingers into my leg with a terrifying, silent intensity. I froze completely. He leaned in close to my ear, his breath hot against my skin. To the rest of the oblivious table, it looked like a tender moment of intimate affection between a devoted husband and his wife, but the smile plastered on his face was a venomous mask. His voice was a harsh, icy hiss that cut straight through my dignity. "Sit down and be quiet. You have no idea who you are sitting among." The sheer cruelty of his warning slammed heavily into my chest. He genuinely believed I was nothing more than an ignorant, low-level technical support worker, completely incapable of grasping the high-level concepts being discussed by these titans of industry. He was terrified that I would open my mouth, embarrass him with some mundane comment about resetting router passwords, and ruin his one chance at securing a lucrative connection. I swallowed the thick lump in my throat, the familiar sting of humiliation washing over me like cold water. I sank back into my plush chair, my voice extinguished once again by the man who was supposed to be my greatest champion. But the universe has a highly precise method of correcting imbalances. As Julian pulled away, his fake, charming smile returning to its full wattage for the executives, a sudden, heavy silence fell over the opposite end of our table. Sitting precisely 3 seats away from me was Marcus Vance. He was the billionaire founder and chief executive officer of the most powerful technology conglomerate on the Western Seaboard. Marcus was a man whose mere presence commanded absolute reverence in any room he entered. He had been quietly slicing his steak for the past 20 minutes, seemingly indifferent to the lesser executives clamoring for his attention. But suddenly, his silver knife clattered loudly against the fine china plate. The sharp noise pierced the low, elegant hum of the ballroom. Marcus had stopped his meal entirely. His piercing, analytical eyes bypassed the groveling executives, completely ignored Julian, and locked directly onto me. He sat perfectly still, staring at my face with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. 10 agonizing years. A whole decade of my life had been spent meticulously folding myself into smaller and smaller shapes, just so Julian could take up all the oxygen in the room. When we first exchanged our vows, I genuinely believed we were building an equal partnership. I thought his fierce ambition was an intoxicating drive that would push us both forward. But somewhere along that decade-long journey, my very existence, my intellect, became a direct threat to his fragile ego. It was simply easier for him to cast me as a silent supporting character in his grand theatrical production of success. The hidden reality was that I was the lead security systems architect at the firm. I designed the invisible cryptographic frameworks that protected major financial institutions and highly classified federal databanks from total collapse. Yet, whenever we attended his lavish cocktail parties, country club mixers, or high-stakes networking dinners, Julian would casually drape a heavy arm around my waist and boldly lie to his colleagues. He would tell them I worked a basic customer service hotline for an internet provider. She helps confused people figure out why their home wireless routers are not working. He would say with a patronizing, booming chuckle. He deliberately and maliciously downgraded my entire career to a pathetic punchline. He reduced my complex architectural masterworks to answering angry phone calls about forgotten passwords. And for 10 long years, I swallowed the bitter correction. I smiled those tight, close-lipped smiles and let him have his unearned stage, foolishly believing that maintaining a peaceful marriage required my absolute and silent submission. He never saw the true value in what I did because my highly classified work did not come with glossy business magazine covers, public accolades, or 7-figure public bonuses. My victories were fought in total silence, when I spent 72 straight hours awake on a Tuesday, surviving on nothing but black coffee and sheer adrenaline to rewrite a failing firewall actively targeted by overseas crime syndicates. There was no celebratory champagne toast waiting for me at home. Julian would simply walk past my dark home office, glance at my bloodshot eyes, and sigh loudly in deep annoyance because his favorite suits had not been picked up from the dry cleaners. To him, my demanding career was nothing more than a trivial, inconvenient hobby. It did not generate the kind of flashy, liquid wealth that bought luxury yachts or secured front-row tickets to elite charity galas. He measured a person's worth entirely by the brand of the imported watch on their wrist and the square footage of their glass corner office. My invisible, exhausting battles in the digital trenches meant absolutely nothing to him. That was the exact reason I was forced into this suffocating, heavily beaded velvet dress tonight. The only reason Julian insisted I attend this exclusive summit was to serve as his living, breathing prop. He had spent the last 3 months obsessing over a massive merger contract. His own firm was quietly bleeding money, failing to innovate, and he desperately needed Marcus Vance's massive conglomerate to acquire them to save his own skin. A deal of that incredible magnitude would catapult Julian straight into the stratosphere of the corporate elite, guaranteeing him the executive vice president title he had been violently coveting. But Julian had done his research. He knew Marcus Vance was notoriously traditional, a man who highly valued personal stability and strong family foundations in his business partners. So, I was dragged away from my critical system updates to play the specific part of the devoted, adoring, simple wife. I was the visual proof of Julian's supposed reliability. My only job tonight was to look pretty, nod at the right times, and absolutely never speak out of turn. The memory of his harsh, silencing whisper still burned violently against my ear. But the atmosphere at the table was rapidly and unexpectedly shifting. The air grew incredibly thick, heavy with a sudden electric tension that had absolutely nothing to do with Julian's desperate networking efforts. Marcus Vance, the untouchable titan everyone at the table was sweating to impress, had completely tuned out the sycophantic chatter of the surrounding executives. Slowly, deliberately, Marcus reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored jacket and withdrew a sleek, matte black tablet. He tapped the screen awake. The faint blue glow illuminated the deep, serious lines of concentration on his face. He swiped past several heavily encrypted folders until he opened a top-secret security schematic. I could not see the actual screen from where I sat, but I watched Marcus's eyes with intense curiosity. They darted from the glowing digital document down to the table, and then snapped directly onto my face. His thick brow furrowed in utter, unadulterated disbelief. He looked back down at the tablet, his thumb tracing a specific line of text, and then his piercing gaze shot back to me. The shock registering on his powerful face was so profound, it looked as though he had just witnessed a physical impossibility. The surrounding executives slowly noticed the abrupt, freezing change in Marcus's commanding demeanor. One by one, their loud, boastful conversations faltered and completely died away. The polite clinking of expensive crystal glasses ceased. Even Julian finally realized something was terribly wrong. His charming, fake smile faltered heavily as he desperately tried to follow the billionaire's intense line of sight. Julian froze completely when he realized Marcus was staring directly at his supposedly insignificant, unintelligent wife. The silence at our end of the banquet table became absolute, deafening in its heavy intensity. Marcus Vance leaned forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow over the pristine white linen. Without breaking eye contact with me, he slid the black tablet smoothly across the polished wood, stopping it exactly in front of my dinner plate. The screen displayed hundreds of lines of complex, elegantly woven code. He looked me dead in the eye, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with a careful, overwhelming reverence that instantly commanded the undivided attention of every single person breathing nearby. "Excuse me," Marcus said, the sheer weight of his words dropping like a heavy anvil in the quiet room. "Are you the author of this core source code?" I lowered my gaze to the glowing screen resting next to my untouched dinner plate. The lines of syntax glowing against the dark background were as familiar to me as the lines on my own palms. It was a proprietary firewall architecture, a highly intricate labyrinth of defensive algorithms. My heart skipped a heavy beat inside my chest. I recognized it immediately, because I had written every single line of it exactly 6 months ago. It was the frantic, undocumented countermeasure I had deployed to neutralize a massive, polymorphic ransomware infection that had violently breached a nationwide medical healthcare data system. The brutal attack had threatened to lock down critical, life-saving patient records across 52 different hospitals, and I had built this exact digital fortress in the dead of night to trap the malicious payload before it could execute its final destruction. The heavy silence of the ballroom pressed violently against my eardrums. I slowly lifted my eyes from the tablet to meet the intense, unwavering stare of the billionaire. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat and gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," I said, my voice barely above a whisper at first, before I cleared my throat and spoke with much firmer resolve. "Yes, Mr. Vance, that is my architecture." A profound, almost theatrical sigh of relief escaped Marcus's lips, a sound entirely out of place for a man known for his impenetrable, ruthless stoicism. The sharp tension in his broad shoulders instantly evaporated. He slammed his large palm flat against the table, rattling the expensive silverware and making the nearby guests jump. "I knew it," he declared, his voice booming with undeniable triumph. "I have had my top acquisition team tearing the entire industry apart for half a year, frantically searching for the rogue engineer operating under the alias D. Wright. You vanished right after isolating that breach, leaving absolutely no digital footprint, and I have been hunting you ever since." Beside me, Julian physically jerked as if he had been struck by a high-voltage current. The blood drained so rapidly from his face that his expensive spray tan looked suddenly grayish and sickly. The reality of the situation was entirely incompatible with the pathetic, fabricated narrative he had constructed for his life. In his supreme arrogance, he simply could not process that the untouchable titan of industry was speaking to his trophy wife with such naked reverence. Desperation clawed at Julian's features. He adjusted his silk tie with trembling fingers and let out a loud, high-pitched, and incredibly awkward bark of laughter, violently trying to shove himself back into the center of the narrative. "Oh, Marcus, please," Julian interrupted, his voice dripping with condescending panic. "There must be some kind of hilarious misunderstanding here. My Delilah is wonderful, truly, but she just tinkers with home computers. She handles basic tech support for frustrated customers. She does not understand the macro-level operations of enterprise networks, let alone global security architecture. You must certainly have the wrong person." The temperature at the table seemed to drop below freezing. Marcus Vance did not even bother to turn his head to acknowledge Julian's existence. He treated my husband's panicked interruption as if it were nothing more than the annoying buzz of a common housefly. The dismissal was absolute, brutal in its silent execution, keeping his piercing eyes locked entirely on mine. Marcus leaned even closer, completely shutting Julian out of the physical space. The invisible wall between the two men was thick and impenetrable. "The polymorphic worm was actively mutating every 3 seconds, Marcus said, his tone shifting instantly into rapid, high-level technical inquiry. "Standard quarantine protocols were failing across the board. My own engineers said the system was unrecoverable." "How exactly did you manage to predict the decryption sequence and isolate the virus payload in record time without triggering the fail-safe deletion sequence?" For 10 years, I had bitten my tongue. For 10 years, I had let mediocre men dominate conversations with incorrect assumptions while I played the silent, pretty accessory. But the cage door had just been blown wide open, and I was not going to stay inside for another second. I squared my shoulders, the suffocating velvet of my dress suddenly feeling like battle armor. I did not predict the sequence. Because attempting prediction against a dynamic algorithmic mutation is a mathematically flawed approach, I stated clearly, my voice ringing out with a cold, sharp authority that I had buried for far too long. Instead, I built a recursive mirror environment. I tricked the ransomware into believing it had successfully breached the central server cluster by feeding it synthetic, ghost data. Once it committed its resources to encrypting the phantom files, it forcefully locked its own mutation cycle. That gave me a 32-millisecond window to sever its command and control link, effectively starving it to death before it could touch a single real patient record. The men sitting around the grand table stared at me with their jaws practically resting on the pristine tablecloth. The arrogant cloud storage executive, who had been loudly spewing nonsense earlier, looked as though he had stopped breathing entirely. The sheer volume of my specialized knowledge and the aggressive, superior technological mindset I casually displayed had utterly paralyzed the supposed experts in the room. They were witnessing a masterclass, delivered by the woman they had ignored all evening. Beneath the heavy linen tablecloth, I felt Julian's sweaty, trembling hand violently shoot out and grab my thigh. His fingers dug painfully into my flesh. A desperate, physical command for me to shut my mouth and shrink back into the submissive shadow he required me to be. It was the same manipulative tactic he had used countless times before to silence me in public, but the paralyzing fear that used to bind me had completely evaporated, replaced by a searing, white-hot clarity. Without breaking my steady, confident gaze with Marcus Vance, I reached down, grabbed Julian's wrist, and violently wrenched his hand off my leg. I tossed his hand aside with visceral disgust, as if I were discarding a piece of rotting garbage. I did not spare my husband a single glance. I simply kept my eyes locked on the billionaire, took a slow, deep breath, and continued to systematically dismantle every technical challenge he threw my way, fully taking absolute control of the game my husband had foolishly thought he was playing. Eleanor Vance, a woman possessing the kind of quiet, terrifying grace that only decades of old money and unshakable confidence could forge, leaned forward elegantly. The diamonds at her throat caught the chandelier light, but her eyes were entirely devoid of warmth as they locked onto my fiercely vibrating husband. "Julian," she began, her voice a smooth, silken dagger that effortlessly sliced through the heavy tension of the ballroom, "I find myself utterly fascinated. You spent 45 minutes during cocktail hour boasting about your firm's innovative pipeline. You detailed your golf handicap. You even found time to brag about your imported Italian sports car. Yet, somehow, it completely slipped your mind to mention that your wife is a systems architecture genius who single-handedly saved the national healthcare grid. Why is that?" The question hung in the chilled air, demanding a response that Julian was fundamentally incapable of providing. I watched him from my seat, feeling absolutely nothing but cold. Clinical observation. The man who had terrorized my self-esteem for a decade was crumbling. His jaw worked uselessly up and down like a suffocated fish. A sickly, translucent sheen of sweat erupted across his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He stammered, letting out disjointed syllables that formed no coherent words. The meticulously crafted facade of the perfect, supportive alpha male was shattering violently into a million irreparable pieces right in front of the most powerful people in Seattle. He looked frantically at the other executives, searching for a lifeline, but found only hardened, expectant stares. Before Julian could string together a single pathetic lie, Marcus Vance leaned back in his heavy chair, steepling his fingers with predatory calmness. "I can answer that for him, Eleanor," Marcus stated, his voice resonating with lethal authority. "He did not mention her because he has been actively passing off her brilliance as his own." The entire table seemed to gasp in unified shock. But Marcus did not stop there. He reached for his black tablet again, his movements deliberate and unhurried. "Your firm submitted a massive proposal for our merger acquisition 3 weeks ago. Julian, a proposal valued at over $150 million. I personally reviewed the security integration section. It was brilliant. It proposed a dynamic threat response matrix that was light years ahead of anything your mediocre development team had ever produced. I was so impressed that I almost signed the preliminary contracts right then and there. Marcus paused, his gaze shifting from Julian to me, offering a brief, respectful nod before turning the full force of his wrath back onto my husband. But there was a distinct architectural signature in those integration protocols, a very specific, highly elegant way of structuring the defensive nodes. It was the exact same structural signature I saw in the rogue code that neutralized the hospital ransomware. You did not write that proposal. Julian, you do not possess the intellectual capacity to even comprehend it. You stole those security solutions straight from the private draft notes left on your wife's desk. The accusation struck the table like a physical explosive. The polished, polite veneer of the high society banquet instantly vanished, replaced by a vicious, whispering storm of gossip. The executives and venture capitalists, who had been eagerly shaking Julian's hand just an hour ago, were now actively pulling their chairs away from him. The physical distance they created was a damning visual of his sudden, total exile. I watched the eyes of the investors. The respect and camaraderie they had previously shown him rapidly curdled into pure, unadulterated contempt. In the elite circles of high-level tech development, intellectual property theft was the ultimate, unforgivable sin. It was a career death sentence. Julian was no longer a rising star. He was a thief, a parasite who fed off the mind of the woman he kept hidden in his shadow. The sheer weight of the public humiliation broke something inside Julian. Pure, unfiltered panic overrode his usually calculated demeanor. He practically leaped out of his chair, the heavy mahogany legs scraping violently against the marble floor. He stood over the table, his chest heaving, his face contorted in a grotesque mask of desperation. He waved his hands frantically, attempting to weave a safety net out of thin air. That is entirely untrue. You are twisting the narrative. Marcus, Julian shouted, his voice cracking loudly, losing all its usual baritone smoothness. Delilah and I are a married couple. We are a unified team. What is hers is mine. We constantly share our work and our ideas at home. It is a joint marital contribution to society. I simply took our shared domestic brainstorming and put it into a formalized corporate structure to benefit both our family and your conglomerate. It was a collaboration. I sat perfectly still, listening to him weaponize our marriage vows. I remembered the countless nights he slept soundly in our expensive bed while I worked furiously until dawn. Shivering in my home office, there had never been a single moment of collaboration. There was only my grueling labor and his silent, opportunistic theft. He had rummaged through my private workspace, photographed my proprietary algorithms, and pasted them into his own desperate bid for power. The sheer audacity of his lie was sickening, but it was also his final, fatal mistake. The clumsy excuse only served to highlight the undeniable reality of his parasitic nature. These were not naive people. They were ruthless, analytical minds who recognized a fraud the moment he opened his mouth. The investors sitting around us did not offer him a single shred of sympathy. An older venture capitalist sitting directly across from Julian, a man who had been seriously considering a $30 million funding injection into Julian's department, picked up his crystal champagne flute. Julian, desperately misreading the gesture as a sign of professional solidarity, reached frantically for his own glass to complete the toast. But the older man deliberately turned his entire body away from Julian. He reached across the wide table, completely bypassing my frantic husband, and gently clinked his glass against Marcus's goblet. One by one, every single executive and partner followed suit. They raised their glasses in a silent, unified agreement, pointedly ignoring the sweating, standing figure of the man who had invited them. They refused to clink glasses with him. They refused to even acknowledge his physical presence. The rejection was absolute and devastating. In the span of a few agonizing minutes, the man who had spent 10 years trying to silence me had just been permanently erased from the only world that mattered to him. The silence left Julian utterly stranded on his own sinking ship. For the first time in 10 agonizing years, I did not rush in to save him from a social disaster. Instead, I placed my heavy linen napkin neatly beside my untouched porcelain dinner plate. I planted my feet firmly on the carpeted floor and pushed my mahogany chair back. The dull scrape of wood against marble felt like the opening note of a triumphant symphony. I stood up to my full height. I did not look at Marcus Vance, nor did I look at the dozen powerful investors watching my every move. I looked directly into the terrified, rapidly shifting eyes of the man I had called my husband. "Let me be absolutely clear so there is no further confusion. Julian," I said, projecting my voice clearly so that it carried well past our table and into the listening void of the massive ballroom. "I have never, not for a single second, given you permission to harvest my intellectual property to use as a stepping stone for your own pathetic career. There were never any domestic brainstorming sessions. There was no mutual partnership. There was only my solitary, exhausting labor, and your calculated, cowardly theft." Julian desperately reached a trembling, sweaty hand toward my waist, trying to assert physical control. "Delilah, sweetheart, baby, please calm down," he whimpered, his voice pitched into a sickeningly sweet, pleading octave that made my stomach turn. "You are just upset and overwhelmed by the crowd. We are a team. We always have been a united front. Do not do this right now in front of everyone. We can go home and discuss this private matter behind closed doors." The fake pet names tasted like poison in the air. I took a deliberate, sharp step backward, completely refusing to let his skin brush against the velvet fabric of my dress. I looked down at him, feeling a sudden, overwhelming surge of absolute clarity. "We are not a team," I stated, my tone stripping away every single layer of his pathetic delusion. "For 3,650 days, you have systematically belittled my intelligence to make yourself feel taller. You intentionally hid my achievements in the dark because you were terrified they would outshine your own overwhelming mediocrity. You manipulated me, and you tried to condition me into believing that my worth was tied entirely to my silent submission. You did not just steal my code to get a promotion. You actively tried to steal my voice, my agency, and my mind." The heavy, stifling atmosphere of the grand banquet hall shifted dramatically. The ambient noise from the outer tables had died completely, leaving a profound, charged stillness. Hundreds of eyes were locked onto us. I glanced around the immediate vicinity. The wives of the executives, women who had been historically trained to smile politely and fade into the background of these corporate galas, were looking directly at me. Some sat noticeably straighter in their chairs. Others offered small, almost imperceptible nods of profound respect and quiet validation. The powerful female partners and directors sitting at the adjacent tables were not whispering or gossiping. They were watching me with fierce, unspoken solidarity. They recognized the invisible domestic cages we were often placed in, and they were actively witnessing someone finally taking a sledgehammer to the iron bars. Marcus Vance, who had remained a silent, observant judge during my complete reclamation of power, finally leaned forward. He did not need to raise his commanding voice, but the absolute certainty in his tone was louder than a physical explosion. "Julian," Marcus said, drawing my husband's panicked, tear-filled eyes back to the slaughter. "My entire technology conglomerate operates on a strict, unyielding foundation of trust and integrity. I require partners who possess genuine character, not just blind ambition and expensive suits. If a man is willing to manipulate, degrade, and steal from his own life partner, he will inevitably defraud his business associates the very first chance he gets. Therefore, I am officially withdrawing my acquisition offer. All financial and structural negotiations between my firm and your company are permanently terminated as of this exact second." The billionaire's declaration struck Julian with the physical force of a speeding freight train. The final, lethal blow had been delivered to his fragile ego and his bank account. His knees buckled entirely. He collapsed back into his chair as if all the bones had been violently ripped from his body. His arms dropped limply into his lap. He stared blankly at the pristine white tablecloth, his jaw hanging slightly open. He was instantly reduced to a hollow, pathetic shell of the arrogant tyrant who had confidently walked into this venue just 3 hours ago. He did not dare lift his chin. He did not dare meet the eyes of the men who had just watched his entire professional and personal existence burn to absolute ash. I felt incredibly light, the crushing, suffocating weight of his expectations, his endless lies, and his fragile ego simply dissolved into the warm air. I turned my attention back to the head of the table. I offered a genuine, polite, and deeply respectful nod. "Thank you for the evening, Mr. Vance," I said clearly. "And thank you, Eleanor, for the much-needed clarity." I did not wait for a response, nor did I need one. I turned my back on the lavish, diamond-studded table, on the stunned executives, and on the completely broken man who had tried to bury me alive. I walked across the vast expanse of the ballroom. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my heels against the polished marble floor echoed loudly in the silent room. Each step I took toward the exit resonated with the solid, unstoppable beat of a woman who had finally reclaimed her own narrative. I pushed open the heavy mahogany double doors and walked out into the cool, refreshing Seattle night, my posture completely straight, my head held high, breathing in the sweet, unfiltered air of absolute freedom. The early morning sunlight was slicing sharply through the heavy blinds of my home office when the thick oak door was violently thrown open. The heavy brass handle slammed brutally against the pristine drywall, leaving a deep, cracked dent in the paint. Julian stormed into the room like a cornered animal. He looked entirely deranged. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, ringed with deep, purple shadows of pure panic. His expensive, custom-tailored designer shirt from the banquet last night was violently wrinkled and untucked, and he smelled faintly of stale whiskey and sheer, unadulterated desperation. It was glaringly obvious that he had spent the entire night pacing the living room floor, frantically trying to figure out how to manipulate the narrative back in his favor. "Pick up your mobile phone right now," Julian screamed, his voice raw, hoarse, and shaking with absolute, uncontrollable fury. He marched forward and slammed both of his sweaty palms flat onto my glass desk. "You are going to call Marcus Vance this exact second. You are going to tell him that you were overly emotional last night. You will explain that you completely misunderstood our collaborative marital process and that you want the merger acquisition to proceed immediately." He pointed a violently trembling finger directly at my face, his blinding narcissism completely preventing him from grasping the reality of his situation. "Do you have any idea what your pathetic, arrogant stunt has cost me? My board of directors just sent an urgent email demanding an emergency executive meeting in 30 minutes. They are actively plotting to strip me of my operational authority because of your stupid, selfish lies. You need to fix this right now, Delilah." I did not flinch. I did not reach for my phone to call the billionaire. Instead, I calmly looked down at the glowing screen of my own mobile device resting near my keyboard. It had been vibrating silently for the past 2 minutes. The caller identification displayed the main executive conference room of his firm. I reached out, swiped the screen to accept the incoming corporate transmission, and deliberately pressed the speakerphone button. I pushed the device to the exact center of the glass desk. "Julian!" A harsh, heavily digitized voice echoed loudly through the quiet, sunlit office. It was Richard, the senior chairman of his board of directors. Julian froze instantly, all the aggressive, demanding blood draining completely from his face, leaving him looking like a hollow ghost. "We know you are currently listening," Richard continued coldly. "We have spent the entire night doing heavy, exhausting damage control with the powerful investors who were present at the summit yesterday evening. Your actions constitute gross professional misconduct, severe ethical violations, and direct, undeniable intellectual property theft. You have irreparably damaged the corporate reputation of this firm. Effective immediately. Your employment contract is completely terminated. The building security team is currently boxing up your office belongings. Do not attempt to enter the corporate premises under any circumstances. You will be hearing from our aggressive legal department very shortly regarding the catastrophic financial fallout you have deliberately caused." The call disconnected with a sharp, hollow, and terribly final click. The heavy silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Julian stared blankly at the phone as if an explosive device had just detonated on the glass. The last fragile strings holding him together snapped. His legs simply gave out beneath his weight. The man who had ruthlessly demanded my silence for 10 agonizing years collapsed onto the cold hardwood floor. He fell hard onto his knees, his trembling hands desperately gripping the edge of my desk as violent, pathetic sobs began to tear through his chest. "Delilah, please." He openly wept, his tears dripping pathetically onto the expensive wood. "You cannot let them do this to me. I have absolutely nothing left. Please, just call them. Tell them you will give them the exclusive rights to the security code. Save my career. Save our marriage. I will do anything you want me to do." I looked down at his pathetic, weeping form, feeling absolutely no pity, no lingering anger, and certainly no sorrow. He was just a weak stranger kneeling in the ashes of a fire he had started himself. I smoothly opened the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, legally binding document I had meticulously prepared 3 weeks ago. I dropped the finalized divorce petition directly in front of his trembling hands, a silver pen resting perfectly on top of the crisp paper. "Sign it," I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of any human emotion. "My bags are already packed in the hallway, and the moving truck is currently waiting outside. You are no longer my problem to solve." I picked up my laptop, securely turned my back on his pathetic wailing, and walked out of that toxic house for the absolute last time. 6 months later, the suffocating, heavy shadows of my past were permanently erased from my life. I stood proudly in the center of a massive, brightly lit corporate headquarters overlooking the bustling downtown Seattle skyline. The towering glass double doors bore the gleaming silver logo of my newly founded, highly specialized cybersecurity enterprise. I was the sole proprietor and chief executive officer. The venture had been heavily backed by a massive, unconditional $50 million investment from Marcus Vance's private technology conglomerate. The global tech industry had rapidly recognized the sheer, unparalleled power of my architectural designs once they were finally attached to my real, unapologetic name. The true, brilliant culmination of my total freedom happened on a crisp Tuesday morning in November. I was officially invited back to the very same technology summit, not as a silent, decorative accessory sitting at a banquet table, but as the primary keynote speaker. I stood confidently behind a sleek, clear acrylic podium, looking out at a massive sea of thousands of industry leaders, software developers, and global venture capitalists. The bright, warm stage lights illuminated my face. I gripped the smooth edges of the podium, feeling the solid, undeniable weight of my own earned authority. I looked directly into the massive crowd, my voice ringing out with absolute, unbreakable confidence. "Do not ever let anyone convince you that your brilliance belongs hidden in the shadows," I declared to the silent, deeply captivated audience. "Do not let anyone claim ownership of your mind, and never, under any circumstances, let anyone take away your voice. If they ever demand your silence, you make sure they hear you roar." Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Violet Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.